You look at a bowling alley, and the math seems almost embarrassingly simple. Buy a building, install some lanes, and every single frame somebody rolls puts a few more dollars in your pocket. Add a snack bar, rent some shoes nobody wants to touch with their bare hands, and you've got a business that basically runs itself on nostalgia and birthday parties. It feels like one of the last honest small businesses left. No algorithm, no subscription trick, just pins and money. That version of the story is why so many people have lost their savings trying to run one. The real economics of a bowling alley have almost nothing to do with bowling. Bowling is the thing that gets people in the door. It is rarely the thing that keeps the lights on. And once you understand why, you start to see a much bigger and stranger story. One that runs through a Goldman Sachs buyout, two separate bankruptcies of the same company, and a modern private equity playbook that has quietly turned America's bowling alleys into one of the more unusual real estate plays in the country. Start with the number that explains almost everything else. A well-run bowling center generates something in the neighborhood of $50 in revenue per square foot each year. A typical retail store on the same size lot generates $200 or more. That gap is enormous, and it isn't a temporary problem you fix with better marketing. It's structural. A bowling lane is roughly 60 feet long and needs runway space at both ends. Multiply that by 20 or 30 lanes, and you're looking at a building that can swallow 20, 30, even 40,000 square feet, most of it doing nothing more profitable than existing as empty space for a ball to roll through. That single fact quietly decides the fate of thousands of alleys before a single game is ever bowled. A retailer selling shoes or electronics turns every square foot of floor into inventory and impulse purchases. A bowling alley turns most of its square footage into runway. You are in effect paying commercial rent or a commercial mortgage on a building that spends most of its footprint not generating direct revenue. The business only survives if what happens on that small remaining footprint, the bar, the kitchen, the arcade, the party rooms, can subsidize everything else. Which brings up the first real barrier to entry, and it isn't the lanes, it's the machine standing behind them. A pinsetter looks like background scenery, but it is one of the most mechanically demanding pieces of equipment in any small business in America. Every time a ball crashes into 10 pins, something has to sweep away the debris, drop a fresh rack, and reset in a few seconds, thousands of times a day, without human hands touching it. Building one lane with modern equipment typically runs somewhere between $20,000 and $90,000, depending on the pinsetter technology and lane service. And industry estimates from the Bowling Proprietors Association of America put the average full-scale center closer to $4.5 million to build from the ground up. That's before you've sold a single game. And that machine breaks. Traditional freefall pinsetters are complicated enough that, according to equipment manufacturers, they require a specifically trained technician to service them, not a manager, not a bartender, an actual specialist. If that person isn't on site or on call, a jammed pinsetter doesn't just take one lane offline. It takes the party off that lane. It takes the leak match that was scheduled there. And depending on the night, it takes the word-of-mouth review that decides whether that customer ever comes back. One broken machine quietly becomes a much bigger problem than its repair bill suggests. That mechanical fragility is exactly why a cheaper alternative, the string pinsetter, which uses a single cable to yank pins back into place instead of a complex mechanical arm, has become increasingly common in newer and smaller centers. Industry figures suggest a large majority of new U.S. bowling centers are now installing these simpler systems, in part because, as one bowling equipment marketing manager put it, roughly 90% of the routine maintenance on a string system can be handled by regular staff rather than a specialist. That sounds like a minor technical upgrade. It's actually a business model unlock. It's the difference between needing a rare, expensive expert on retainer and being able to run a lane with the same staff pouring the beer. But even solving the equipment problem doesn't solve the deeper one. And to understand that, you have to go back to why there were ever 12,000 bowling alleys in America in the first place. Before the 1950s, pins were reset by hand by workers called pin boys, crouched at the end of the lane in a genuinely dangerous job. In 1946, AMF unveiled an automatic pinsetter, and by the early 1950s, these machines were in commercial production. The effect was almost immediate. The number of bowling centers in the U.S. very nearly doubled in less than a decade, climbing from around 6,600 in 1955 to roughly 11,000 by 1963. On the way to a peak of about 12,000 centers by the mid-1960s. Automation had turned a loud, labor-intensive activity into something quiet enough for families, and developers responded by building enormous suburban complexes, some with swimming pools, tennis courts, and cocktail lounges, earning bowling alleys the nickname the Poor Man's Country Club. Here's the part that made all of that expansion so dangerous in hindsight. It was built almost entirely on the assumption that league bowling, regular teams playing weekly for money, would keep growing forever. By the late 1970s, league membership had indeed peaked at somewhere around 9 to 10 million Americans. It felt like proof that the boom was permanent. It wasn't. Between 1980 and 1993 alone, league bowling participation fell by roughly 40%. By the late 2010s, membership had collapsed to something like 1.3 million people, a small fraction of its former size. The causes stacked on top of each other the way these things usually do. More women entering the full-time workforce meant fewer people with a guaranteed free weeknight. Cable television multiplied the entertainment options competing for that night, and later, video games and the internet pulled the same casual recreation dollars in an entirely different direction. Industry analysts later admitted that bowling's own leadership had misread these trends through the 1980s and done very little to adapt while it still had time. This is the domino effect worth sitting with for a second, because it explains almost every bankruptcy that followed. The building boom of the 1950s and 60s created thousands of large, expensive, single-purpose buildings sized for a demand level, league bowling, that was about to shrink by half. Those buildings couldn't easily become something else. A 60-foot-long, narrow, low-ceiling runway isn't a flexible retail floor plan. So as revenue per lane declined for decades, the fixed cost of the real estate underneath it did the opposite. It appreciated, because the land itself sat on 20 to 40,000 square feet of increasingly valuable suburban and urban ground. Owners were left holding a business earning less every year, sitting on real estate worth more every year. At some point, for thousands of family-owned alleys, the math flipped completely. The building was worth more empty, sold to a developer for a shopping center or condominiums, than it was worth full of bowlers. That tension between a shrinking sport and appreciating BERT is the real engine of this industry's history, and nowhere is it more visible than in what happened to AMF. AMF wasn't a small operator. It was, for most of the 20th century, the dominant name in bowling equipment worldwide, the company whose pinsetters had powered the entire post-war boom. In 1996, Goldman Sachs paid $1.4 billion to buy AMF Bowling in a leveraged buyout, a deal financed heavily with borrowed money, betting that AMF's brand and installed base of equipment could be leveraged into a nationally consolidated chain, something one AMF executive at the time literally described as building the McDonald's of bowling. The company went public the following year. For a moment, it looked like the thesis was working. Then the debt started to matter. By 1998, losses were mounting and expansion plans were shelved. By 1999, the company posted a net loss of $226 million on $733 million in revenue and began downsizing, closing plants and warehouses. By the summer of 2000, AMF stock had fallen below $1 a share and was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. The company was now carrying more than $1.3 billion in debt, almost exactly what it had cost to buy in the first place. And in April 2001, it filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, citing an aggressive acquisition spree of 260 additional centers it had struggled to manage, alongside falling demand for bowling itself. That's the first collapse. What makes AMF such a clean case study is that it didn't stop there. A private equity firm, Code Hennessy & Simmons, bought the company out of bankruptcy in 2004 for $670 million, funded in part by selling and leasing back 186 bowling centers to a real estate investment company for $254 million, an early sign that the smart money was already starting to treat the buildings, not the bowling, as the real asset. It didn't save the company long term. AMF filed for bankruptcy a second time in 2012. Two bankruptcies of the same iconic brand, more than a decade apart, is not a coincidence or a run of bad luck. It's the same underlying mismatch playing out twice, a business with declining per-unit demand financed with debt that assumed the opposite. What happened after that second bankruptcy is the part of the story that actually answers the question of how to make this business work, and it involved almost completely abandoning the idea that bowling itself is the product. A New York entrepreneur named Tom Shannon had, back in 1997, bought an aging Manhattan alley called Bowlero Lanes for $1.4 million and turned it into something closer to a nightclub. Flashy lighting, dance music, upgraded food, a bar pushed to the front of the experience instead of tucked in a corner. When AMF collapsed for the second time in 2012, Shannon's company merged with what remained of it, forming a combined operator running 272 centers with roughly $450 million in annual revenue. That merged company eventually became Bowlero Corporation and more recently rebranded again as Lucky Strike Entertainment. The strategy this new company pursued is the counterintuitive core of this entire topic. It treated bowling as, essentially, a loss leader. Leagues were deliberately de-emphasized in favor of open bowling, private parties, and corporate events. Prices climbed, in some cases using the same kind of surge pricing you'd recognize from a rideshare app, charging more per game during peak hours. Food and alcohol, historically an afterthought bolted onto the side of the building, became a primary profit center, what the industry now calls the eatertainment model, where the margin on a cocktail or a plate of nachos dwarfs the margin on a single game of bowling. And underneath all of it, the company kept doing what Code Hennessy and Simmons had started years earlier, treating the real estate as a separately monetizable asset. In 2023, Bowlero completed a transaction transferring the land and buildings of 38 bowling centers across 17 states to a real estate investment company for roughly $433 million, structured specifically to free up capital for new builds and acquisitions. 2 years later, in July 2025, the company went the other direction, buying back the real estate under 58 of its venues for around $306 million, explicitly to cut long-term rent obligations and regain control of key locations. Sit with that for a second, because it's the clearest possible illustration of the deeper truth. A company that operates bowling centers spent a multi-year stretch selling its buildings to a landlord and then buying buildings back from other landlords. Not because the bowling business demanded it, but because the real estate math did. That's not a bowling company making bowling decisions. That's a real estate and hospitality company that happens to have pins in the middle of it. By recent public reporting, this consolidator operates roughly 350 locations and generates something on the order of $200 million a year in cash flow. Remarkable, given that bowling as an industry is otherwise still shrinking. And that's the healthy-looking metric that hides a weaker underlying reality for everyone who isn't the consolidator. Bowling remains a highly fragmented industry, with thousands of small, independently owned centers still operating on thin margins in exactly the same buildings that made the calculations so brutal 50 years ago. A single large operator with access to institutional capital, sale-leaseback financing, and dynamic pricing technology has structural advantages that an independent family-run alley, still running on the same aging equipment and the same declining league base, simply cannot match. Some bowlers and industry observers have pointed out the trade-off this creates on the ground. As consolidation accelerated, some locations saw fewer on-site mechanics and thinner maintenance budgets, even as prices rose, meaning the same broken pinsetter problem from earlier in this story hasn't gone away. It's just being managed differently, and not always in the customer's favor. So compare the two realistic paths an owner faces today. The optimistic outcome for an independent operator looks like this. Own your real estate outright rather than leasing it. Keep the building in a stable, growing community where land values aren't yet outpacing the business. Modernize into a genuine food and beverage plus events venue rather than a pure bowling operation, and treat league play as a nice-to-have rather than the core of the model. Centers that do this can still be genuinely profitable, with reported profit margins in the 10 to 25% range after operating costs, and payback periods on new construction that can run somewhere between 3 and 7 years. The realistic negative outcome is the one that has already played out thousands of times since the 1960s. An aging building on land that's become more valuable than the business, equipment that's expensive to maintain and needs specialized labor that's increasingly hard to find, a customer base that skews toward a shrinking pool of dedicated league bowlers, and a landlord or developer eventually making an offer for the property that no bowling-based income statement could ever match. That's not a failure of effort. It's the same real estate arithmetic that has already closed the majority of America's bowling alleys, from roughly 12,000 at the mid-1960s peak down to a few thousand today. Which brings the story back to where it started, and to the assumption that felt so obvious at the beginning, that a bowling alley makes money by charging people to bowl. It doesn't. Not really. Not anymore. And arguably, it never fully did. What it actually is, underneath the shoe rental and the disco lights and the birthday parties, is a large, single-purpose building sitting on valuable land, trying to generate enough food, drink, and event revenue on a small fraction of its footprint to justify keeping the rest of that footprint empty enough for a ball to roll down it. Whether that math works depends less on how many people love to bowl and much more on where that building sits, who owns the dirt beneath it, and whether the person running it understands that the game itself was always the smallest part of the business.